Welcome to Dark Files of the USSR. This is the channel where we uncover crimes and darker realities hidden behind the image of Soviet order. Today's story is about a pattern, not just one man. Some Soviet serial killers were dangerous, but the system around them often made them more dangerous. Investigative mistakes, ideological denial, censorship, fragmented information, and pressure to protect the image of the state all helped some offenders stay free longer than they should have. The result was more victims, more fear, and a gap between Soviet myth and Soviet reality. To understand that problem, start with ideology. Soviet power did not simply police society. It also tried to define how society was supposed to work. The USSR built a censorship system early, including Glavlit in 1922, with final authority over printed material and expression. At the same time, Soviet criminology was expected to remain compatible with Marxist theory, even as crime kept existing. Researchers later noted the contradiction clearly. Soviet writers had to explain why crime persisted in a society that claimed to be moving beyond the old social order. That contradiction mattered. If socialism was supposed to reduce the ugliest forms of social breakdown, then a serial killer was not only a criminal problem. He was an ideological embarrassment. That is why some Soviet cases were shaped from the start by hesitation, denial, or silence. The question was not simply, how do we catch this person? It was also, what does this case say about the state if we admit it openly? The clearest example is Andrei Chikatilo. Britannica notes that his case stands out not only because he murdered at least 50 people between 1978 and 1990, but because Soviet police efforts to warn the public were hampered by official ideology, which held that serial murder was impossible in a communist society. A government that struggles to name a danger clearly will respond more slowly than it should. Chikatilo also benefited from investigative failure. In 1984, he was detained after suspicious behavior at a train station. Officers found items that should have raised alarm, but his blood type was misread against forensic evidence, and investigators concluded he did not match the killer they were hunting. Instead of being held on the murder case, he was convicted on a theft charge and released after a short time. He then continued killing. The wider investigation around Chikatilo revealed another weakness: pressure to produce results quickly. In an atmosphere of fear, police and prosecutors could move toward the wrong people instead of patiently building the right case. Histories of the case note that other suspects and false confessions complicated the hunt before investigators finally linked the murders properly. A system that valued closed cases and institutional confidence could accept the appearance of progress before the truth was secure. Then there is Sergei Golovkin, often called Fisher. He was convicted of murdering 11 boys in the Moscow region between 1986 and 1992. What makes his case relevant here is not only the fact that he operated for years. It is how long the investigation remained behind him. Russian reporting says that an earlier attack in 1984 had already triggered a search, but investigators followed the wrong suspect and the case stalled. That meant the danger was visible before the full scale of the pattern was understood, yet the system still failed to stop it early. Golovkin also benefited from the ordinary face he presented to the world. He worked as a livestock specialist, had a stable job, and did not look like the kind of person Soviet society expected to fear. TASS later described him as an ordinary worker who stood out in no obvious way. That matters because some Soviet investigations were slowed not only by ideology and bureaucracy, but by trust in normality. And that points to a broader truth. Soviet failures were not always dramatic. Sometimes they were slow failures. Information stayed inside separate offices. Warnings were limited. Patterns were recognized too late. Authorities hesitated to admit what kind of offender they were dealing with. Investigations moved through bureaucracy instead of moving directly toward truth. Together, those delays could become deadly. The Soviet information system made this worse. A state built around censorship and controlled narrative was not designed for open public warning. Britannica's description of Glavlit and preventive censorship helps explain the larger culture. Information flowed downward through permission. In that environment, admitting that a serial predator was active across multiple districts or republics was never just a policing decision. It could become a political one, and political decisions are often slower and more defensive. The result was a dangerous mismatch. Serial murder investigations need speed, pattern recognition, public cooperation, and a willingness to follow ugly facts wherever they lead. Soviet institutions often favored secrecy, image protection, and hierarchical control. Those instincts were not created for this threat. In some cases, they collided directly with it. This does not mean every Soviet investigator was incompetent. Several famous cases were eventually solved because investigators kept pushing through false leads, assumptions, and bureaucratic obstacles. But that only strengthens the point. These offenders were often caught late because people finally overcame parts of the system that had slowed the search. That is why this subject matters, beyond true crime. It tells us something larger about authoritarian failure. A closed system can look strong from the outside because it controls headlines, files, and language. But when a threat appears that requires openness and fast adaptation, those habits can become weaknesses. Protecting the image of the state may preserve authority in the short term, but it can leave ordinary people less protected. So how did Soviet failures help serial killers stay free longer? By making some dangers ideologically difficult to admit, by slowing warnings to the public, by misreading evidence, by following the wrong suspects, by trusting appearances too much, and by placing bureaucratic control ahead of rapid transparency. In the end, some Soviet serial killers stayed free longer, not only because they were cunning, but because they operated inside a system that was slower to face reality than reality demanded. And when the state protects its image before it protects its people, the cost is paid by ordinary citizens. This is Dark Files of the USSR. If you want more fact-based stories about hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker side of Soviet history, subscribe and stay with us.